Let's do this. The Cult of Hockey podcast by the faithful and for the faithful. I'm David Staples of the Edmonton Journal, and I'm here today with Bruce McCurdy. Hey, Bruce.
Hey, David. How you doing today?
Good. So I still have my believe. I was thinking of taking down the believe thing, but I was thinking that actually, in terms of the contract negotiations coming up, the believe icon for the Oilers is more important than ever, or as important as ever, because it's only with the players believing in the Oilers that the Oilers can get the necessary players at the necessary contract term and price in order to compete for the Stanley Cup. That's just the fact of the matter. That's the defining feature of this summer of contract negotiations, is essentially how much are the players, the key players that the Oilers want to sign, how much are they willing to give up in terms of contract value in order to play on a team that they believe will compete for the Stanley Cup in the next 1 to 8 years. 1 year to 8 years for some of them.
Yeah.
It's the key issue. It's the major issue of the summer for the Edmonton Oilers. And if there's no belief, if they have to pay absolute top market value, as the Oilers have had to do, generally speaking, all along, on almost, until very recently, I'll suggest, till the last couple of years, they've had to do that. They're not going to be able to afford to keep this team together, not even close. So that's my reasoning. What do you think of my reasoning?
Yeah, well, they're going to have to find some bargains in there for sure, because they, not only are they paying top dollar, but they're committed to it for a number of years for many of their, especially secondary players. They got the Draisaitl one coming up this summer, or, starting the window opening this summer. McDavid window opening next summer, and then we got other ones that are sprawling on into 27, 28, 30, that are, committed big dollars for a long time to players who are probably better now than they will be at the time their contracts end.
Bruce, for this podcast, we'll go through the list of players who have to be signed this summer, and we will go through. Essentially, that's the thrust of it. But we'll just start quickly with a little bit of talk about the GM. And I don't think we need to do. I guess we could do, if we wanted, like a full recap of Ken Holland's term as general manager. I don't know if we want to do that. I mean, he's going. There was some good moves, obviously, some bad moves, obviously. I guess that scoring him on the Cult of Hockey's 10-point system, where 10 is transcendent GM and 1 is unacceptable GM. I'll give him a 7. I think he was a good GM. Maybe even 7.5. Was he a great GM? No. I don't think. I think there's too many ifs. And just really quickly, the Campbell signing, the Cassian contract, the Nurse contract. These deals, and the Nurse one's still yet to fully be comprehended, because we don't know how the player is going to react to this particular down point of his career. So he could come back strong, and you just never know. But, and it balanced against that is the Hyman signing, the Ekholm trade. I think of the Evander Kane signing, trade, I should say, or whatever that was. I guess he was a UFA signing. Broberg and Holloway seem to be turning out as top 2 draft picks, although that's still a bit of an unknown. So I say he did a good job. Well done, Ken Holland. You took a team that had failed to make the playoffs 2 years in a row. You made them 5 years in a row. And in a tough Canadian market where Elliot Friedman quoted Ken Holland as saying, total chaos in a Canadian city is 2 periods away at all times.
Pretty
Great line. That is a great line. The thing that I like best about him, Bruce, was his patience. It marked his approach to everything that he did, and I think it's in a Canadian market where there's such alarm, overreaction, incredibly strong opinions, diametrically opposed on every single player. I think patience and calm goes a long way in shepherding a team through that kind of tension and turbulence. So I really appreciated his attitude, and I think it now pervades the team. I think, Knobloch wasn't his hiring, but I'm seeing the same. You see the same kind of calm patience in Knobloch. I think Jeff Jackson, from his press conference yesterday, he's the chip off the same block. Again, he's not Holland's hiring; he's Cates' hiring to the succession plan. But he's showing that same patience, and I think it's absolutely essential for a Canadian market. What's your take on Holland?
Well, it's mixed. I'll say this, when he took the job in May of 2019, he said there would be successes and good moves and bad moves, and yes. He says, my hope is I can come in and provide stability, check. Select a coach that's going to have a real impact on this team, check. Especially, the coach that he's got in place now. I'd like to think with stability, we're talking playoffs in 1920. Well, that happened. But it's more than just making the playoffs. It's about trying to make the playoffs year after year after year. Check, 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 check. And go on some playoff runs. Check, check, and check. The last 3 years, they've at least made it through one round consecutively to the conference final, to the what I call a division final, and then the Stanley Cup final. The core is here, check, and the core is still here. Now I have to go out and surround that core, and he certainly did that. And the question is, to what degree did he succeed there, and to how much of the future was sacrificed in order to get to the now that is currently the last Monday.
I guess one interesting way to look at it, Bruce, is we can't say how someone else would do in Holland's shoes because we just don't know, right? We don't know. Could anyone else have pulled off the Ekholm trade? He did that because of personal contacts, right, with Nashville and a relationship there. So we don't know, and that's the best thing that he did, right? So I'm just kind of weighting the deck in that question. But I think we can compare him, let's say, to Toronto. They, how did they do in their Matthews-Marner window? They're the closest comparable team in terms of a Canadian hockey market with a couple star players, and Nylander. How did that team do? Well, if you do and with Kyle Dubas, and there's a whole host of Edmonton fans who would have been overjoyed if the Oilers had been able to hire Kyle Dubas as opposed to Holland in that same time. Well, I think Holland clearly did better. Now, you could say the Oilers had McDavid, who is clearly the superior, Matthews and Draisaitl are kind of maybe equivalent. So it's not really that fair because McDavid just changes everything. And I think that would be fair. But this is the closest comparison that I could think of. And Holland did pretty good because Toronto have they won a playoff series?
One playoff series in the Cap era.
And was that
was last year.
Okay.
They finally beat Tampa in 2023 in the first round, and then got wiped out by Florida in the second round.
And both teams have had their woes. Holland comes in, and Sekera and Clefbaum go out with injury, and then Larson leaves. So but every NHL team has its challenges. It's not. That's the job, and injuries are expected part of the course. McDavid and Draisaitl haven't gotten hurt in any significant way, except on some playoff runs where they've been, a shadow of themselves at times in the playoffs. But So anyway, I just think that what would you give him out of it, Ken? I'm going to put you on the spot, Bruce. I'm going to give him a 7. I'll give him a 7.5 in the end. 7.5 out of 10. What would you give him?
Yeah, I think 7's a fair score. I like good. I mean, to be great, bring on that Stanley Cup. Some people were expecting 2 or 3 in this window, as I wrote in my post about Holland and what he leaves behind. I set my over under at 0.5. If they won even 1 cup in those 5 years, that's a win. It's hard to win the damn thing, obviously.
Sure is. It's an effort.
And there's other teams out there, and some of them are good, and some have, great management teams of their own. And some of them got, whatever you need in the playoffs, be it, getting hot at the right time, just injury luck, puck luck. You need kind of all of those things. And sometimes even when you have it all your way, it's not a guarantee. Like if you told me before this year's playoffs that the Oilers would have records for the cap era, or indeed this century, performances for points, goals, and assists by forwards, and points, assists by defensemen, and that their penalty kill would actually outscore the opposition in 2 different series in the playoffs, I would have said, we got it. Like, where's the weakness? Well, the weakness turned out to be 5-on-5 play, I guess, with a team, even with all that scoring,
players getting injured,
players getting hurt.
Key player injured. Draisaitl's drop in play.
Draisaitl was a shadow of himself in the finals, and that was that. If he's 100%, I think they probably win that series. I'm quite confident they would have.
I think so too, Bruce. The way he played against LA and even Vancouver when he was initially hurt, but they would have beat. I think they would have beat Florida, but his injury was significant. And having lived through the 80s, what strikes me is that it's so much harder to win the Stanley Cup now. And it's not just because there's 32 teams as opposed to 21 teams, which makes it 1/3 less likely, I guess, you're going to win if you look at it that way.
Right.
But the parity of the league based on the structure of the league, the salary drafting structures, all the structures around the league, the freedom of movement of the players, makes it so much more difficult to accumulate and keep the very best talent. In the 80s, you just held onto your draft picks forever. They were not free to go anywhere. You drafted good players, you kept good players. So I guess if you had a team that drafted as well as Barry Fraser did in the early 80s, maybe you could go on a similar kind of cup run because they'd all have them in their prime of their career on really great contracts.
Like Toronto, you mean?
Like Toronto now?
Well, it had the fantastic rookie class in 2016-17.
Yeah. So,
they were all on good contract. It worked for Chicago, worked for Pittsburgh, that they won when their stars were still on their entry-level contracts and really hugely outperforming their contracts.
Chicago's a good comparison because I think if they could have kept that Blackhawks team together with all the players, if they could have kept paying for the players that they had, they might have been able to go on a run of about 4 or 5 cups, I think, because that team was just stacked with talent and they just kept losing players because they couldn't afford to keep them. Although they did bring in Marian Hossa, they expended their money. So they used the system too to improve their team. Anyway, I just think comparing the 2 eras, I just think it's way harder. And this is why we're not seeing dynasties like we saw Habs, 70s, Islanders, Oilers. It's the freedom of movement of players. It started with Gretzky moving and all these players increased freedom at age 30, then 31. And in the 90s, the increased freedom of players has changed everything in terms of dynasty hockey in the NHL.
And the salary cap has changed
everything
enormously.
Yeah, again.
Anybody who's, you can only fit so many players. It's not like you can do the Detroit thing and have a $120 million payroll and go out and bring in Brett Hull and Luc Robitaille in the summer to your already swollen payroll. You just can't do that kind of thing anymore.
And the weird thing is, if we had the old system now, with the money the Oilers are making, they'd be the team at the $150 million a year payroll, probably. Whatever it would be right now, the Oilers would be one of the top spending teams. Bruce, let's move on, and let's just start going through the list of contracts that have to be signed.
I got some news to announce, which probably won't be by the time this podcast goes anywhere. The Oilers have started the process as of 17 minutes ago. Edmonton Oilers have signed defenseman Cam Dineen to a 2-year, two-way contract extension with an AAV of, wait for it, $775,000, the NHL minimum. Dineen played 58 games for the Condors, scoring 5 goals and 20 assists. So the process has started with a very
modest,
fundamental, low-level signing, but at least it starts the ball rolling down the hill, which is going to pick up a lot of steam in like the next what's this, the 28th? Yeah, I got like 2 days from now. At least they have to issue qualifying offers to their restricted free agents, and they got that much more time to have free negotiations, without other teams involved for all of their unrestricteds, which is quite a number of players.
Dineen is probably will probably be like the 11th
list, yeah.
Well, 11th or 12th on the Oilers organizational chart by the end of this.
Oh, right, in terms of where he's on the depth chart.
Yeah.
Even
in the minors, like he's behind Gleason and Kemp, and I guess Niemelainen's probably not coming back. He didn't have much of a year, did he?
Niemelainen is a Group 6 free agent, and I would think, and so was Dineen, meaning that he's 26 years old, but he hasn't played enough NHL games to, if you haven't played 80 games by then, you become so you can't just get buried on one team forever.
Okay.
Unless they've really given you a shot.
Bruce, I'm just going to start with the defensemen in terms of the list, and we'll work our way to Draisaitl at the end, which is the most substantive and important part of this conversation we're going to have. But we'll start with so right now there's decisions to be made around Bouchard's contract, keeping or trying to move Cody Ceci and Vincent Desharnais. Bob Stauffer was on Oilers Now, floating the notion that Desharnais might sign was it a 5-year deal at $2 million a year, 4 or 5 years at $2 million a year? And immediately Brendan Escott and Reed Wilkins objected. Bruce, it's interesting when Bob says things, because he is clearly he works for the Oilers. He puts out narratives that are Oilers friendly at times, but he's also incredibly hardworking and knowledgeable. And so when he says things, I put like extra super weight on it as a real possibility that this might happen. I don't think he's just, often saying things. He's heard things. So that's an interesting thing. If he's heard that, and he didn't say he had, but I often take that as the case. I didn't like that idea at all, honestly. I think one of the things in the cap era that you need to do is pay your bottom pairing defensemen about $1 million a year each. And I think if you're competing for the Stanley Cup, you should be able to get decent defensemen who are willing to come to your team for that amount of money. And I've liked Vincent Desharnais. I love his story. I love his attitude. I love, there's just so much to like about him. But there's nothing to like about paying a bottom pairing defenseman $2 million a year, I don't think. I think it would be a real overpay. And the fact of the matter is, 2 years in a row, Vincent Desharnais has essentially played his way out of the out of the lineup. I don't know if he did last year. Did he get taken out of the lineup last year? I think he did. In the playoffs, And it's because his puck handling. First year it was because his defense and his puck handling wasn't up to snuff. And this year it was his puck handling. He doesn't move the puck well enough to, at this point, and this could change, he could get better, to compete against the very best teams like Dallas and Florida. There was no getting by Dallas unless they had better puck moving. And I said, I'm not saying that in retrospect. I said that before they played Dallas. I was certain of it. And it turned out to be the case. They had to take him on and put in Philip Broberg.
Mm-hmm.
So, because you can't have Desharnais and Ceci on the same two right shot guys who struggle to move the puck and still beat a good team. It's not going to happen. So now they could trade Ceci,
Yep.
and so Desharnais would be that guy then. So maybe that makes sense, but it's still a lot of money for a third pairing defenseman. How do you see it?
Well, it's a lot of term, David.
Yeah.
You know, like 5 years is, I mean, if you're sure, like, I mean, in a perfect world, you get the Mayfield contract that Lou signed in Islanders 5 years at 1.45 million. It was a very unusual deal for its term for, what was then a third pairing defenseman. I just don't see that his stock went up or even stayed steady in the playoffs. He had a real tough playoffs. He did get hurt. He might have been dealing with a couple injuries. He broke his finger late in the season in a fight. And then he got hurt when he got low-bridged by Trevor Moore in the LA series. Really dirty hit. And he got, I think he got fined for it, not suspended, but fined, meaning it was a dirty hit. And his play suffered. And I mean, he was -9 in the playoffs, and finally they took him out. And he watched the last half of the Dallas series and the entire Stanley Cup Finals from above. And it's how you get from there to a $10 million contract. I don't quite follow the rationale. And I think, unfortunately, from the player's perspective, the loyalty that he surely feels towards the team that gave him a chance against all odds would have had some of the shine rubbed off of it from that, experience in the press box, watching, every game of a 7-game Stanley Cup Finals.
Did you know he played one game, didn't he? In the finals, Ceci sat one game. I think he did play.
Oh, maybe so. Yeah. Anyway, he got
game 3.
Yeah, game 1. Anyway, it was early in the series, and
yeah.
You might be right. I'm just thinking when Broberg got in, Broberg stayed in, was where I was coming from.
Yeah.
And Broberg's a guy that they can sign for less than $2 million. If they give him a 1-year deal, they can almost dictate terms for Broberg.
So I want to correct. Here's what Bob actually said, because there's an important distinction, and my apologies for not getting this right. He said Desharnais could sign in another city for 5 years at $2 million. So that's what Bob's saying the market is, and Bob, I think, is absolutely probably correct in that. Now, of course, what if that's the market? And so again, Desharnais like everybody else. Let's say he could get that, and I don't think it's outrageous. There's always some team that's looking for toughness and size, and he certainly provides that. He's still in the prime of his career. Arguably, he could provide for a team that doesn't have cap issues. Some real, like, you could see the Chicago Blackhawks wanting to protect Connor Bedard with a big, tough guy, and he's a decent enough player, solid enough on the penalty kill. I could see a team like that making a move like that, or San Jose with Macklin. Is it Celebrini or Celebrini? Celebrini. It's not the like Celeborn from the Lord of the Rings, mandatory Lord of the Rings reference. So anyway, for the Oilers, that contract doesn't work. Now, would just the $2 million cap hit kind of stops me, Bruce, for the Oilers, honestly. I don't see how it works for the Oilers. So could you go to $1.5 million over 3 years with Desharnais, or 2 years? I think you're not going to get that toughness that you get from Desharnais.
Right.
from probably not from another player in that size,
Hmm.
but I think he can get much of what he brings for $1 million a year. Certainly the better puck moving for $1 million a year is solid defense in the end. Yeah, I think you can get that.
Hmm.
So likely not to stay if he wants to cash. And I think he needs to go, probably the smart decision for him is to go on the market and see what it has to offer and get the best contract he can get, because it would be his first major contract.
Yeah. First and possibly only major contract.
Yeah.
And, you can see why the player would want to maximize that. And his agent will surely be pushing him to at least look at the market and then circle back to Edmonton, as we've seen in the past players do, where one of Holland's moves was, yeah, you go out and see what you can get and come back here at the end of day on Canada Day or its equivalent, and our offer will still be there, but it might not be there for long because we might have to sign someone else. And we saw that with Brett Kulak as one example.
What happened to Tyson
Alex
Barrie?
Chason as a more infamous example, where they actually signed. Mike Smith did it, where they briefly went on the market, found no particular good interest, and thought, no, I'll go with what I know, at least, or and so now
Did it
Ken
have
Holland
did
isn't here anymore. So
that happen with Tyson Barrie too? I think I remember.
I think they signed. That was a pretty wild day. That was the day they traded Ethan Bear for Warren Fogle, and they signed Barry to the 3-year extension that's just expired now. I'm not sure that he isn't the highest priced right shot defenseman currently going to market in terms of what he made this past year. And he is a long way down the list of right hand defensemen that are available. But, they, that happened. And it was, it all came down sort of the day before free agency opened, or even the morning of that day,
Yeah, I thought he might have actually kind
like
of gone to
just
market, but I
before
could be
10
wrong.
o'clock on the day in question. And so they locked him up, but right at the last minute. They also did that with Evander Kane, where I think they signed him the night before. So sometimes these things, last year they signed Matthias Janmark on June 30th, when free agency finally got back to the July 1st date that we've been accustomed to. And it's, there's lots of hardcore negotiating that's going on. There's a few guys that I'm sure we'll be talking about that team's got exclusive negotiating rights for 2 more days.
Cody Ceci, he's got 1 year left, I think at 3.25 million. And I'll say this about both Ceci and Desharnais. Desharnais did okay in the playoffs with Kulak, and then when he was moved to play with Darnell Nurse, his game caved in. And this was an ongoing occurrence with players paired with Darnell Nurse until they paired Darnell Nurse with Kulak and Broberg. A clear indication that if you're going to rely on Darnell Nurse to be the number one puck mover on the pairing, you're in trouble, and so is his partner. It's not going to work. He needs to be paired with a player who is at least can really, really move that puck well. And Ceci and Desharnais, both of their stock took a huge hit, I think, in Edmonton because of that pairing. And they might be a little bit sore about that, both of them in their secret, quiet moments. Ceci actually, I thought, looked good with Kulak in the playoffs and played well with Kulak in the playoffs. And of course, in Game 7, we all have a little bit of a glow about Cody Ceci because of that pass that he made to Connor Brown. Bruce,
And a counter glow about Brett Kulak for giving up the slot to Sam Reinhart.
Yes, I got in a lot of hell from readers yesterday. I wrote a piece about Knobloch's couple of mistakes that he made, which I talked about on the podcast previously, and people were many people were really upset to point that out. But I guess my answer is we try to be fair to people, fair and accurate, and we point out mistakes by the players all the time when they make mistakes. Mm-hmm. Draisaitl and McDavid, we point them out. I do, and you do. We both do. And so I just did the same with the coach, and
I did the same
Kulak.
with the GM.
You do the same with, and it's fine. I mean, some people don't like it. They really objected to any criticism of Knobloch, but and maybe I'm wrong. So, but still said what I said, and I still believe that it was a fair comment. Which was that Knobloch needed to play Connor Brown and Matthias Janmark more in the third period because McDavid and Draisaitl were absolutely gassed in the last 2 minutes. That was my point. And that he should never have gone in with Ceci and Nurse in the first round of the Stanley Cup finals, first game of the finals, because it was a proven disaster at that point. So those two things, in and otherwise, I give him an 8.5 out of 10 as the coach in the playoffs. I think he was outstanding and made a gutsy call for the ages with the goalies against Vancouver. But he made, I think, a few mistakes. All right, move Ceci. Bruce, do you think they can trade him without eating much or anything, or maybe even get something in return? I think it's a possibility.
Yeah, well, the problem number one is they haven't got a whole lot left to eat, right? They traded so many of their draft picks away. Like they have one pick tomorrow in this weekend in the top 150. Third year in a row, they had one pick in the top 150 in the draft, which is to say the top 2/3 of the draft. And they got a handful of, fifth, sixth, seventh picks. So they have some picks, but how much value do they have in a trade? I mean, if someone will take that contract and it costs you one of those sevenths to do it, well, probably you do it. But they haven't got a third, or for years to move along in a deal.
You shouldn't
like
have
that.
To give up. Do you think you should have to give up?
I think that contract is movable. I think that player has value to certain teams in certain situations. Teams that are, just struggling to field a proper, decent NHL team with some experienced players, that are, trying to build with young players, need some mentors, need to reach the cap floor. A guy like Ceci could have value to Chicago, Utah Hockey Club.
Toronto.
What's that?
I mean, Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa. Like, listen, there's lots of teams with crappy defense cores. He's a veteran right shot defenseman.
Mm-hmm. He made that pass. He put that pass on loop, and you say, take this guy.
Listen, he can arguably play.
You might even get a little bit back for him.
Top 4 minutes. He could arguably top 4 minutes on a weaker team. On this team, no, not with Nurse at least. Maybe if you paired him with Matthias Ekholm in the top 4, he'd hang in there. But no, not with Nurse. That pairing's not going to work here. We know that. Mm-hmm. So, but if you're looking, let's say you got a really good left shot D-man who's a little smaller guy, a little weak on defense, and you're looking for a reliable partner, and you're a team in the bottom third of the NHL or like mid-tier to below that, Ceci could be a good player for you next year if you have the cap space and his contract isn't a killer. So I think they might even get, I'll say a 4th or 5th round draft pick for Cody Ceci. You might be able to have a little bit of a market for that player because of what he brings. And I know will shock people in Edmonton because I see the numbers. Well, here's Leon's numbers with Cody Ceci, and I just think, man, is that ever kind of a obscure kind of way to look at things? There's 5 players on the ice, and there's a certain amount of randomness to how things turn out. And he was paired. We saw in the playoffs. Was Cody Ceci really the problem, or was it a slumping Darnell Nurse? So,
or slumping Leon.
Or a slumping Leon. Like, this is it. Which Leon Draisaitl are we talking about? The one who's injured?
Well, here's the thing. When you stack your first line with the top 2 defensemen on the team, no question, and Ekholm and Bouchard, McDavid and Hyman, and Nugent Hopkins was the most common. Well, what's left for your second line? That's going to be still facing some pretty tough opposition. And the gamble is you're taking more with your first line than you're giving back with your second. But if you're thinking your second line isn't going to take a hit, I'm not sure that's that realistic, and
I think he's a bit underrated is my final statement on Ceci.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a bit underrated here in Edmonton.
Yeah. Well, he's slow, right? He loses so many races to the puck on
That's true.
retrievals.
That is
On
true.
retrievals, it drives me nuts. You know, like you can have a 15-foot head start on a retrieval, and he gets there and it's a saw off. And like he's in the way a lot. Like he's the kind of defenseman I call a thwart. You know, like you come in, you whatever you're doing, he's in the way of whatever it is you're trying to do. And he's strong as an ox, but he's not overly physical. I kind of wish he was a little bit more physical, but he does have
Yes.
his positives. And one of the, well, a major positive really is he's a very experienced player and had now some good experience going deep in the playoffs. And that that might have value. Boy, that if he had a Stanley Cup ring, it would be even that much more value. But that milk's been spilled.
Yeah, I think he's a veteran player who realizes if he plays physical, he's probably going to get injured. So he'll stay away. But you're right. It is if he played physically, the owners would probably be that much more interested in keeping him.
Yeah.
But if he's the third pairing defenseman on this team, which he'd have to be because the nurse thing doesn't work out anymore, we all know that. And kudos to the people who pointed that out before, much long before I did. You know, there's people questioning that, although we got on it when it became a real problem starting in February. Uh, anyway, Bruce, let's move on to Evan Bouchard. And all I'll say about him is I think it's not going to be it's going to be maybe one of the last items of business. I think first of all, Bouchard needs to see what's happening, and the Oilers need to see what's happening with Draisaitl, how much money is going to be left, and then they need to essentially. What I think the Oilers will be hoping is that Draisaitl will set a standard for the team in terms of taking as what I will call the Stanley Cup discount, not the hometown discount, but the Stanley Cup discount, in terms of taking a contract which is very Stanley Cup friendly for him and the team. And it's a less percentage of the salary cap than he could get in another city, maybe 2 or 3% less of the cap, or 4 or 5%. I think some team would offer Leon Draisaitl the maximum over 7 years, 20%. I think there's teams out there that would do that. So it's going to, it's going to be considerably less than the highest possible bid. And I think if Draisaitl does that, it makes it that much easier in the Bouchard negotiation for him to think about that and for them all to fall in line. Although a lot of these contracts are going to be signed before the Draisaitl contract's resolved, but I don't think the Bouchard contract will be. So I think that the Oilers will be hoping for Draisaitl's contract maybe to send a message, and once that happens, that's when the Bouchard contract will be finalized, possibly with Bouchard also going along the same lines of thought.
Yeah, well, they're very different negotiations in the sense that, I mean, they're both can be negotiated starting Canada Day. The
Yeah.
Oilers have, a 1-year window, in theory, but Draisaitl is unrestricted at the end of it, and Bouchard is still restricted at the end of it, meaning the Oilers can carry the Bouchard negotiation a whole lot deeper. And in fact, as long as they qualify him, they can even take it into the next summer to do the negotiation. But so I agree in the sense that I don't think it's as high a priority for Edmonton. Obviously, it is a priority, but it's not the Darnell Nurse situation in 2021 either, where he had a year to run and they signed him that July. I think it was July. It might have been August. It was early in the window anyway, and but he was going to be UFA at the end of it too. So they wanted to get that detail taken care of before the season. Whereas there's every reason to say, well, Evan Bouchard could play out the whole season, and it's not a risk. That they don't have to trade him at the deadline or potentially wind up with nothing, as some folks would say about the Leon situation. It's just a different dynamic for a player who's a restricted free agent.
Bruce, just three. I'll just quickly say on their second contracts, three defensemen who were star players. Erik Karlsson got 10.1% of the cap. Drew Doughty got 10.9% of the cap, and Cale Makar, who signed in 2021, he got 11% of the cap. So these are all at this point comparable defensemen to Evan Bouchard, and so anything that would be the high end. I'll put it that way, that would be the best comparison for Bouchard if he was really pushing it, and he's saying he's at the same as these players. The highest is about 11% of the cap for Bouchard. I don't know what that works out to off the top of my head, but 11% of the cap. Let me just see. I can quickly
close to 10 million. It's of the current cap. By next summer, the cap will probably have gone up again to 92. So call it 10 million. I think
it would be, if he signs right now, it would be $9.7 million cap hit at 11%. Right. So that's the kind of maximum. It would be nice to see a contract. If he was to take, let's say, 10% of the cap or 9% of the cap, that would be a Stanley Cup friendly kind of contract. Less likely in some ways for a young player who's really has made a lot of money, but hasn't really cashed in to secure his family for the rest of his life, if he's wise with his money, which is always a big caveat with anyone on earth. So anyway, we'll see. And I think that's right. It's the last. I see that as kind of the last piece of business for a number of reasons. Let's move on to the forwards now, Bruce. And we'll start with the wingers. Corey Perry, what would you do?
I would say thanks for coming. And you gave it our best shot, and you taught our guys a few things, but we have other plans.
I don't think he can help, Bruce. And I think a different player in the end. I mean, maybe he was hurt in the playoffs, but he is at the age where you're going to get hurt. And maybe he provided in the regular season enough leadership this year that it was a good bet. And I'll stick to that. I think it was a good bet on Corey Perry this year. It was worth trying that. I don't think it's worth trying again. Bob Stauffer talked about maybe a contract with bonuses with Perry. I mean, they do not need him. Anyone who's a bottom line winger at this point with bonus situation in his contract where he's going to take more salary cap the next year. I just think that should be a non-starter. If he came in at the league minimum, you could sign him, because you can sign as many players as you want at the league minimum. If he goes to the farm team, then he earns it down there if he can't play in Edmonton. And maybe that's the understanding. Yeah, we'll sign you, but you might be playing in Bakersfield this year. Would you be okay with that? Would you be a leader down there? Would that work for you? Because they needed more out of their fourth line. The last two teams to win the Cup, Vegas and this year Florida, had big, tough, aggressive players on their fourth line. Corey Perry is tough, but he wasn't aggressive because he didn't have the speed to be aggressive, to get in there and make the kind of plays that aggressive players make. I can hardly remember a big physical play that he was involved in the playoffs, maybe where he wasn't on the wrong end of it. So
yeah, the one where he hurt himself, where he ran the guy, he got a penalty, I think, for boarding or charging, where it was against one of the Kings defensemen, and it was Perry himself who got the worst of it, crashing into the end boards and banging up his knee. And I'm not sure he was ever as good after that as before. And he was, slowed him down, and he didn't have any margin for error in terms of being slow.
Yeah.
And he just was having trouble getting to where he needed to get. And next year he'll be turning 40 instead of 39. I can't see that changing.
I'm cool if he signs a league minimum contract, no bonuses. And anyway, well, Warren Foegele.
Yeah, it's interesting. You hear all this talk about Jake DeBrusk, he's a choice free agent, and he's going to, he's getting 4 point something this year, and he's going to get $5 or $6 million on the free agent market. And you look at Jake DeBrusk statistics against Warren Fogel's, and it's like they're the same player. They don't get any points on the power play. Everything they get is bought and paid for at 5-on-5, but it's 40 points. And 40 points at 5-on-5 does have value. I think he covered the bet this year at 2.75 million.
Did he ever?
But then in the playoffs, he wound up in the press box for the second time in 3 years as an Oiler. I think both the first and third years he played every game in the regular season and then became a coach's decision in the playoffs. That's not good. And the trouble is that he's $2 million over the league minimum with his salary, and the Oilers need those margins where they can get him. Now, can they replace Warren Fogel's 40 points? Well, sure, they can replace him with Jake DeBrusk on the free agent market for $3 more million, or they can give some other player an opportunity in that circumstance and hope that he gets, 27 points for a half or a third of the cost, and use that money to deal with other issues on the team. Because for one thing, they got $3.5 million in bonuses to pay off next year, so they've got, they need the space. So I like Warren Foegele as a player. I think he brings lots. I think he probably, off his regular season, earned a nice raise. Off his playoffs, I think on the market, his market value would have cooled off a little bit, but he's still probably going to get a raise. And I'm just not sure that the Oilers are the team to give it to him.
He was very heartfelt in his season-end interview, and he just wanted to make it clear to everyone that he was hustling as hard as he could in the playoffs. I was working my bag off. As he
always does. Yeah,
he was. And you know what? For the last half of the previous season and all of last season, he was in the regular season at even strength. He was like the second or third best Oilers winger. He was a really good player for the Oilers. Last year in the playoffs against Vegas, he was good. He had a good final against the Florida Panthers. Otherwise, he didn't really find his way. And part of it is I don't know if he's a top six winger, like as a third line winger. Maybe that's the idea with Warren Foegele, just stick him there and go. So how much do you want to pay a third line winger? He's in Desharnais' thing. Yeah. He's in the same situation as Desharnais. He probably needs to and wants to desperately and should cash in, get as much as he can on his next contract. So, and if he does that, good for you, Warren Foegele. You really did work hard and appreciated as an Edmonton Oiler by many people, if not if not all people. But his drop in play between the regular season, in terms of his two-way play, was I think the most of any Oilers player in these playoffs, between the regular season and the playoffs. He really had a major drop, more than anyone else. So that goes against him. If you had any hopes he's going to be a top six winger on the Oilers, I don't think that's going to happen. So you can't pay him $4 million a year here. He might be able to get that in another city. All right.
I wanted to pay the core 12.
Yeah.
And the third line winger, by our definition at least, is outside of the core 12. There's only the 3C, first two lines, 3C, first two D pairing, and your starting goalie. That's the 12. And everybody else on the roster, if you're averaging much more than $1 million per for sort of the second 12 on your big roster, then that's a deficit that you haven't got available for your top 12, not to mention all your other dead cap commitments and stuff like that.
So here's two more players not in the core 12, Janmark and Brown, who were strong. Janmark was, I thought, strong in the regular season. Brown, we all know his story. He's injured coming back from injury, got better as the year went on, but had a pretty mediocre overall regular season. Then both players were on fire as the playoffs went along, to the point where in the Stanley Cup final, they became, other than Zach Hyman, they were the two best wingers on the Oilers. I think at even strength better than Ryan Nugent-Hopkins in the Stanley Cup final. So they really were playing great hockey. Now, Stauffer, I think, talked about 1.2, 1.3 million for Janmark, and I think they're talking hopefully kind of more league minimum-ish for Brown, or $1 million a year for Brown. Man, I could see a team coming along and offering either of those players $2 million a year for a year at least, maybe even longer term, based on their penalty killing was historic together, Bruce. The numbers that we keep in terms of suppressing grade A shots, making mistakes on grade A shots, like you want to make as few of those as you can. Brown and Janmark were off the charts good. The best two Oilers in that regard, them and Ekholm. They were the core. Brown and Janmark and Ekholm were the absolute core of that outstanding penalty kill effort. So, and I'd include Nugent-Hopkins in that group as well. If they can get them for that amount of money that's being talked about, you snap them up in a second. But what if you have to pay $2 million a year for either of them? What do you do?
Yeah.
Heavy sigh.
You take a heavy sigh, start with that, and you may find, you have to figure out how much you have to spend. Like I say, you can average $1 million per on your non-core 12, the second dozen, and you can go 1.5 on a guy here if you got two other guys making the league minimum. They'll have some of that in there. But you don't want to be going into the $2-3 million range for those guys. If you squint hard and say, well, Connor Brown, the player we saw at the end of the playoffs, is now the reconstructed Connor Brown, we might see him as a top 6 winger on the team. Maybe we should pay him more. And how much, he knows, I think in his heart of hearts, that he wasn't a $4 million player over the course of the season. That said, Holland signed him, I think, primarily for the playoffs, and by playoff time, he was a good player. And so was Janmark. Case can be made for both of them being $2 million guys, I guess. And teams that really want him, if they do, they can get him. Unless those guys decide, I was so close to the Stanley Cup. I'm on the right team. I'm with the right players. I've made good money over the course of my career. Let's do another year, even 2 years here at a, maybe below market price. And it's hard to say what market is, but if we're watching the Stanley Cup finals, you'd think would say, ooh, that'd be a nice player on our team. And both of them were outstanding. And, just looking up here, penalty kill in the playoffs for the Oilers. Connor Brown played 34 minutes, and the Oilers outscored the other guys 3-1, 4-on-5. Janmark played 50 minutes. The Oilers outscored the other guys 3-2, 4-on-5 for shorthanded. And it was, the performance of the penalty kill was historically good, and they were a big part of it.
And I should add, so was Fogle. He was a pretty good penalty killer as well.
Was, where are you, Warren?
Just by our numbers, mistakes.
He was 26 minutes, and neither team scored.
Pretty good.
Zeros. Nurse and Ceci also 0 goals against in their time on the penalty kill.
Cody Ceci was really good on the penalty kill.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Bruce, let's move on to
Campbell and McLeod, 0 goals against.
Yeah.
Quite amazing.
Okay. Evander Kane. So his name was coming up in a buyout. I just think that, man, did they miss Evander Kane? There's another player, right? Like in the final, if he had been healthy, hard to stay healthy, maybe at his age, kind of playing the kind of hockey that he plays. That super physical play. But he was critical, Bruce, in beating the
Oh,
Vancouver
man.
Canucks. Him standing up to Zadorov, him pounding Quinn Hughes, him pounding Drew Doughty. These had a major impact against very tough LA King and Vancouver Canuck teams. His offense was good, opportunistic, getting grade A shots, scoring the odd goal. Then he got hurt. I mean, he was hurt through it, and then it just got worse and worse and worse until he couldn't play. I think what you want to do is hopefully he gets better. Hopefully he gets better. Like I think you could trade him. I think there'd be a market for Evander Kane. You'd get something in return. I don't think you need to buy out Evander Kane. But and I know there's griping that he didn't practice. Like, there's hard feelings about that. I don't know. Like,
Who's got the hard feelings?
I
Oilers Twitter or actual Oilers?
Well, I just heard talk like, if he's not going to practice, that's a problem. Like, he's got to practice. And
Wow.
Anyway, I just thought, man, that guy came through for the Oilers, gave it all he had until he had nothing, absolutely less than zero to give. And so I don't think he's going to be bought out. I'd be shocked unless there's stuff we don't know about, behind the scenes stuff that we don't know. But I think he could be traded in any case. I wouldn't trade him. I'm hearing a lot of talk about the Oilers need to be more physical. The Oilers need to get, more aggressive. You're going to get rid of your most intimidating, aggressive hockey player who can still play hockey when he's healthy at a fairly high level. Makes no sense to me. So I keep Evander Kane and work with him on his rehab.
Well, I got 3 letters for you. NMC.
Yeah.
There's a no move clause, so you can talk about trading him all you want, unless the player goes along with it. I mean, the reason he committed to Edmonton for 4 years was he thought he found his place where he wants to be, and he's already burned some bridges elsewhere in the league. Unfortunately, David, that early in his first full season in Edmonton, he had that horrific injury after 14 games.
Yeah,
and I'm not sure he's ever been the same player since. Looking simplistically at plus minus as a reference frame, he was both years, last and this year, -4 in the regular season. And in the playoffs, he was -3 last season and -7 this season. And, he scores. His defensive play is pretty indifferent to my eyes. And obviously, none of that puts the value on the physical play that you and I value, that you got to have somewhere in your lineup. And Edmonton did, to me, really miss him against Florida. They could have used him against the likes of Bennett, Kachuk, Ekblad, and so on. And not having that, that bulldog to throw out against those guys was a disadvantage to me for the Oilers. But the fact is that he's a 30-plus power forward, and guess what? This is pretty common. This is why you don't sign guys like James Neal and Zach Cassian, to name a couple, to 4-year deals in their 30s, because they don't necessarily make it to 34.
Yeah, I think if he hadn't been injured, he would have been fine. They do get injured, but I think his play, Bruce, in terms of like his rate of major mistakes on grade A shots in the playoffs, Hyman, Janmark, and Brown had the lowest rate of major mistakes for Oilers wingers. But Kane was right in the middle, and he was better than Perry and Fogle, and considerably better than both Nugent Hopkins and Holloway. He had a considerably lower rate than Nugent Hopkins and Holloway. His defense was fine, and the -7 I'm going to suggest is, if you looked at those goals against, I don't know how many he'd be personally responsible for. That number
some
can be
misleading. He's on the empty net team, so some of it would be that. Because he'd be the 6th guy that they add to the power play to stick in the net front, assuming that they ever get the puck anywhere near the net front before the other team has sunk a 180-foot shot into the empty net, and everybody gets a minus, right?
Yeah. All right, Sam Carrick. For me, he didn't show enough in the playoffs. If he wants this again, he's like Corey Perry. If he's willing to sign for a league minimum, and he might be, then you could keep him as a depth player. Yeah. I think that works for me. He didn't particularly stand out in the playoffs in a good way. Wasn't impactful, I didn't think. Maybe a few hits, but he didn't bring much in the way of offense at all. Derek Ryan outplayed him, which is why Derek Ryan played more than he did. So, and neither of those players played particularly well. But as a depth signing, it works for me. How about you?
Yeah, just as a 12, 13, 14 forward. Yeah. And I mean, he does bring a little bit of toughness. He does bring a little bit of face-offs. He was 63% in his 16 games during the regular season on the dot. Playoffs, I haven't got figures for that because Hockey Reference doesn't do them. He played 9 minutes a game in 10 playoff games, 1 point -1. He had very little, I would say, impact. A few things here and there, some good, some bad, but minimal. I'd say minimal impact.
I agree. Ryan McLeod. Now we'll combine two players here, Jack Campbell and Ryan McLeod. Now it's interesting because Campbell's yet to be put on waivers. People, I think most fans are expecting him to be bought out. That's the talk around. But Jeff Jackson, the interim GM, the team hockey boss right now, said no decisions have been made and they're exploring different options with him. And that was
fast.
They better explore him fast. Ryan McLeod was okay in the playoffs last year, maybe good in the playoffs last year. This year he wasn't that good. He scored a couple of key goals, and he's a fast player. But I think almost all of us, except for the biggest, and there's huge Ryan McLeod boosters out there, except for the biggest boosters, got tired of him flying by obvious checking opportunities. And defensively, Bruce, he had some issues defensively. He wasn't as good as he needs to be. For a player with minimal offense at times, he needs to be super sharp on defense, and he wasn't. He was a culprit on the first goal against Game 7. But he was also a culprit on a number of other goals. Like he didn't have a particularly good defensive series or a good defensive playoff. He didn't get a lot done. He was a good penalty killer. But he's earning $2.1 million. It's players play themselves off teams competing for the Stanley Cup. And McLeod may have done that because he has value to other teams. He may blossom still into a really useful third-line center and possibly a second-line winger. There's that possibility. I could see him having real value to another team. He's still a young player. And as a sweetener and moving Jack Campbell's contract, do you object to that or not?
My friend Darcy McLeod, Wood Guy on Twitter, floated that exact scenario yesterday. Maybe you caught wind of it or some breeze.
Stauffer had mentioned it on the preview.
Okay. Then that's maybe even where Darcy got it from, or maybe Stauffer got it from Darcy because they do talk to one another. Yeah. Anyway, he said, how about McLeod and Campbell as a package deal to San Jose, who do need a goalie and who do need, young, decent players. And I would hate to give up on this guy because he's grown into he's got a lot of things that you like. And throughout the season, like he was running basically 57% on every metric there. Shots, scoring chances, goals scored when he was on the ice, expected goals, like it was bought and paid for. He was 57%, like 4-4, 3 against. That's a great ratio over time. In the playoffs, he was -7. And part of the, unfortunately, too many guys in the playoffs who got outscored, couldn't tread water when the big guys were on the bench. It would hurt, like for what he brings, for what he costs, like he really makes a huge difference to Oilers' team speed. Like, when it comes to Oilers' speed, you got McDavid, you got McLeod, and then
Holloway,
Holloway.
Kulak.
And then,
Let's not talk about
you
the
got a little
defense.
bit on the
Kulak,
back end.
Broberg, and Nurse.
You
Yeah.
got some on the back end, but it would hurt. But you're going to have to sweeten that pot, or otherwise you're going to be eating that Jack Campbell, even if it's a buyout. It's cheap the first year, 1.1 million, but then it gets expensive the second year, just when the Draisaitl and Bouchard extensions kick in, and you don't have a lot. So it would be so good to get rid of that without retention would be fantastic. But you're not going to do it by just saying, here, take Jack Campbell, please. Um, but you might be able to convince a team like San Jose that is not, really strong in the net. Like I think Campbell, in the right circumstance, could still perform, but he's not a $5 million bet at this point.
Correct. Exact word
Right?
I would use.
I mean, he might even perform like a $5 million goalie in the right circumstance, but you can't sort of count on that, obviously. So to move that along, you're going to have to pay, and it might cost you more than McLeod. It might cost you McLeod and
Pick.
a second round pick in 2030 or whenever the next one is that they actually have.
Yeah, the team speed argument you bring, Bruce, is a really strong one, and it's if they lose Fogle, for instance, as well, he's another fast forward. Yep. So then
get some fast guys coming in.
Yikes! Well, maybe they can though. Like this is the thing. Like there are players who might be willing to come here, so I think that's a possibility. Adam Henrique, man, it would have been nice if they started the playoffs with him and Janmark and Brown as their checking line. But it took him a while to get there. Henry got hurt, and they wanted to try him on a wing. He's been the third line center the Oilers have needed forever. He is, though, 35 next year.
And he's expensive, and he's going to still be expensive.
Yeah, if he's willing to take a discount, I think, you bring him back in a second. Because I think, again, I'd love to see the Oilers go into the season with Brown, Janmark, and Henry as their third line. I think that's a winning combination. And we'll see about that.
What would you be prepared to pay for the line if you were able to sign all three guys? What would be your upper limit cap to get it done?
Six. We both think, jinx.
Well, Henrique is a core 12 player because he's either a 3C or he's a top 6 swing.
He is a core 12 player. So if he gets 3 and the other ones get 1.5 each, that's the maximum that you could go. It's not just what you're prepared. It's what is the maximum you can possibly go. Right. So,
and 3 would be like basically half of what he's accustomed to from his prior contract that's just expiring.
The good news is he has made a ton of money. In the NHL, and players, they're in a different position. Once you've grossed $50 million, you're in a slightly different position than someone who's grossed like $5 million or $10 million. It's a tremendous difference in your decision making, I think. Bruce, let's just wrap up quickly with Leon Draisaitl. We'll probably do a full podcast on the Draisaitl contract as things develop. But just here, I'm going to give you the scenario. Just quickly run through the scenarios. I'm going to write a post on this later today. So I looked at the 8 comparable players to Draisaitl. These are players who, if they were traded 1-for-1 for Leon Draisaitl, there are other forwards. I only picked forwards who were traded 1-for-1 at the time when they signed their third contract. So they all signed their entry-level contract. They signed their second contract, which is Draisaitl's just ending, and then they signed their third contract, usually around the age of 27. Draisaitl's going to be about 28 or 29 when that happens. So
29.
These players are Austin Matthews, Nathan McKinnon, Jonathan Toews, Patrick Kane, Evgeny Malkin, Sidney Crosby, Artemi Panarin, and David Pastrnak. Those are my comparables for Leon Draisaitl. And I cut it off at William Nylander and Elias Pettersson because I thought if you did a 1-for-1 trade for either of those players for Draisaitl, people would be saying, what? Why would you make that trade? But I thought each of these other players at that age, if you made a 1-for-1 trade, some of them would be like, well, what are you going to include? And some others like, that makes sense. And the others like, you might have to give a little bit more. But anyway, I thought they were close enough. Yeah, for Sid. Maybe for Toews, possibly. I don't know.
Toews, yeah. I mean, those are very, very high-end players.
So, yeah. So, anyway, you know, they're all pretty close, except for maybe Crosby at the very top is in a different category, and maybe McKinnon. Anyway, so Bruce, on those players' third contracts, average age signing was 27. Average term was 7.9 years. Matthews dropped that down by signing for 4 years.
Right.
Crosby signed for 12. That was when you could still sign for 12.
Right.
Here's the key. The average percentage of the cap when they sign the contract, according to Cap Friendly, and this is the moment they sign the contract, which I think is the key.
That's the way to do it. Yeah.
Is 14.9%. So let's say 15%. They took 15% of the cap on average.
Against a max of 20%. That I don't think anybody's ever gotten a max.
No one's. I think McDavid could have got it.
Happened. Yeah, he could have.
You know, and Crosby probably could have got it if he had pushed.
They did the Stanley Cup / hometown discount themselves to.
Okay, so here's the scenarios, Bruce. The Stanley Cup discount I'm saying would be, so the average is 15%. Mm-hmm. I think if Draisaitl is taking a serious Stanley Cup discount, I'm saying that's 13%. That's 2% lower than the average superstar signed for. And that would be a cap hit of $11.4 million a year over 8 years. So that's the Stanley Cup discount. The middle scenario, which is what I'm going to suggest is the average.
Sorry, what are you using as your cap?
88.
Oh,
he'd sign it.
Okay.
He'd sign it. Yeah, that would be if he signed it this summer. The cap's 88, and that would be 11.4 million.
Right. Sure.
Okay. The middle scenario, which is the average 15%, is 13.2 million. So if Draisaitl signs for 13.2 million, that's kind of like the what's the Goldilocks. Not too much, not too little, right in the middle.
Hot, not too cold.
Not too cold, right in the middle. That's the Goldilocks scenario. The high scenario is actually what's been floated. Frank Saravalli said on Jeff Jackson's board, it's written $14 million. That's the high scenario. That's 16% of the cap. Not even Austin Matthews took that on the 4-year deal. Austin Matthews took 15.9%. None of the other players, the next highest was McKinnon taking 15.3%. No one's taken 16%. So I'm saying that's the high scenario for Draisaitl. Mm-hmm. That would be $14.1 million cap hit over 8 years. So that's kind of actually been floated already, and I didn't see too many people in Edmonton batting an eye at that. And then there's the highest scenario, which is 20%. That's the highest legal amount that you can take. 20% of 88 million is $17.6 million a year. That's the highest. So I'm hoping that he takes like 13.2 and under. Anything like that is to me that's the Stanley Cup discount is $13.2 million a year and under, and more than that. And it's obviously if he signs for $14 million a year, nobody's going to complain in Edmonton. But he's not doing the team or himself any favors in terms of wanting to win this. Taking a hit to win the Stanley Cup is the truth. That's just would be the fact of the matter. Mm-hmm. And so what do you think? What do you make of all that?
The other aspect of not doing yourself any favors is the perception out there that's so heavily driven by salary. Fans are always measuring players against their cap hit. And if they're not measuring up to it, boy, do they ever get lambasted for it. And probably Leon's a guy that couldn't give a crap about that. I'm just thinking in terms of his general demeanor. But if you value being popular among the fan base, that's a slight more incentive to find a happy medium as opposed to the max possible. If you want that, you go to market, and the Oilers say, well, we're still going to rent you for the last year of your deal. We're not going to sell you off at the deadline so we can get something and say we got something for you, because what they're going to get for him if he does go is that cap space, which has huge value. People say, let them go for nothing. Well, you're letting them go and you're opening up $8.5 million in cap space to replace them with. That ain't nothing. And so to me, like, I don't even entertain the idea of moving the guy. But you negotiate hard, you try and find a way to make them fit. And if it doesn't work, then you use that cap space and you find a different way to make that work.
Yeah. I think he wants to stay. He says, obviously, more than
like
anything else in life, he loves being an Edmontoner. That was quite a thing to say. That was a great quote from him. So much appreciated in Edmonton that he said something like that. And music to everybody's ears here. And people in Toronto, I was listening to a few of the Toronto podcasts like Kipper and Bourne, and they were a little bit about that because they still what they're hoping for is either
he built a house outside of Toronto, David. Didn't you know he and McDavid are planning to move there?
Well, what they want is either to him to sign for the highest possible cap hit at Edmonton, or for him to leave and come to Toronto. One of those two things will make people in Toronto happy, but such is life in the NHL. I feel the same way about players on other teams too. So they're like, I'm not any different than they are. Like if Matthews is going to sign, he signed for the highest possible amount that any superstar has signed for, the most amount, and I'm glad about that. Good, have them pay that cap hit for Austin Matthews. Bruce, we've been going at it for quite a while here. Any final thoughts or anything you'd like to add?
Well, just that they have a bunch of RFAs that they have to submit qualifying offers to at minimum by day after tomorrow. And it's an absolute no-brainer that they do so for Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway. And all the other RFAs on the list that are expiring this year are all down in the minors. James Hamblin, Raph Lavoie, Carter Savoy, Noel Hoffenmeyer, Ryan Fanti are the guys that are RFAs, and I think Fanti's gone. Hoffenmeyer, I'm not sure that he's did anything to particularly. The other guys, the young forwards, I don't think there's any harm in extending you might as well keep the assets you got and let them develop while you've got rights on them. But there's relatively few decisions to make in that department, and by far the questions are the UFAs. We didn't mention Sam Gagner, who I think will retire and may well find a spot in the team. In the structure of the team, player development or equivalent. And Troy Stetcher, I think they let him find his way. And Calvin Pickard would be the only other one where you say, what do we do with that guy? Yeah. And you bring him back. And then you figure out between him and Olivier Rodrigue, who's under contract, but who would have to clear waivers next year, how best to fill the number 2 position, and Stu Skinner's locked in at number 1.
Yeah. With Pickard, I'd say, again, like he's got to be closer to $1 million than $1.5 million. I heard talk of $1.5 million for him. I just don't see it. He'd have to go elsewhere. All right, Bruce. Well, you're covering the draft tomorrow.
Yeah.
Good luck with that. Thanks for taking that on.
Got nothing to cover tonight, do we?
Yeah, nothing to cover tonight. Thank goodness. And well, not thank goodness, but it would be nice to have a first round draft.
I'll be watching. If there's a trade or something happens, we'll cover it. But I'm expecting the action to be tomorrow, frankly.
All right. Thanks for talking today.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
And in the meantime, and in between times, this has been another edition of the Cult of Hockey podcast.